This week, a first in U.S. history. Congress recommends criminal charges against a former president, accusing Donald Trump of fomenting an insurrection and conspiring against the U.S. government. Also, we'll review the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. What was accomplished and what wasn't? And where do U.S. Africa relations go from here? And I'll speak to the U.S. Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, Desirée Cormier Smith, about efforts to combat racism, racial extremism, and xenophobia against people of African descent. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome. I'm Haydé Adams. Thank you so much for joining me. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress has made criminal referrals for a former president. The committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol is urging the Department of Justice to bring 4 criminal charges against Donald Trump, including aiding the insurrection. VOA's congressional correspondent Katherine Gibson has more.
The year-and-a-half-long investigation into the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol concluded Monday after 10 public hearings and more than 1,000 witnesses.
If we are to survive as a nation of laws and democracy, this can never happen again.
The panel of 7 Democratic and 2 Republican lawmakers making a historic recommendation about former President Donald Trump's role in the insurrection.
January 6, 2021 was the first time one American president refused his constitutional duty to transfer power peacefully to the next.
The committee cannot pursue criminal charges, but it did make 4 referrals to the U.S. Department of Justice, recommending 4 charges against Trump.
The committee believes that more than sufficient evidence exists for a criminal referral of former President Trump for assisting or aiding and comforting those at the Capitol who engaged in a violent attack on the United States.
Lawmakers also said Trump should be charged with obstruction of their investigation, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and conspiracy to make a false statement. The last item in relation to Trump's efforts to appoint false electors as part of a scheme to overthrow the 2020 election results.
We understand the gravity of each and every referral we are making today, just as we understand the magnitude of the crime against democracy that we describe in our report. But we have gone where the facts and the law lead us, and inescapably, they lead us here.
The committee also recommended criminal charges for Trump lawyer John Eastman and ethics investigations into potential Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy and 3 other Republican members of Congress.
You don't concede when there's theft.
Trump has criticized the committee's work, calling it unfair and unbalanced. But much of the testimony came from members of his own staff.
If the president had wanted to make a statement and address the American people, he could have been on camera almost instantly.
Katherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
Well, turning to other news here in Washington, the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit has concluded with billion-dollar goals plus a hint of a presidential visit to the African continent. President Joe Biden repeatedly stressed his administration's deep commitment to Africa and urged the continent's leaders to respect the will of their people. VOA's Anita Powell reports for us from Washington.
U.S. President Joe Biden capped his 3-day summit of African leaders by hinting that he may come visit.
As I told some of you, you invited me to your countries. I said, be careful what you wish for, because I may show up. The poor relatives always show up. The wealthy ones never show up. The poor come and they eat your food, stay longer than they should. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in your home countries.
It's a striking joke from the leader of the world's wealthiest nation, touting U.S. plans to deliver $55 billion in assistance to a continent struggling with food insecurity, inequality, and a painful legacy of colonialism. But jokes aside, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations told VOA that a presidential trip would have a big impact.
this will be an opportunity for the people of Africa, whatever countries, if the president decides to make such a visit, that they will actually see our commitment to them.
These grand gestures and big promises contrast with the quieter diplomacy happening at the summit of 50 African leaders, which included meetings between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and leaders of Ethiopia and Congo, both countries with active conflicts, and with stable West African allies Senegal and Southern African energy giant Angola. Analysts say the U.S. is trying to work with a range of African partners, regardless of their track records, on issues where they can find common ground.
I think what Washington is trying to do is diversify its relationships on the continent and not make them dependent on any one leader or any one group of countries. Because what we have seen is these countries remain fragile, and a strategic partner today could be engulfed in civil war tomorrow.
Biden also invited the leaders of Congo, Gabon, Liberia, Madagascar, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone to a private meeting on Wednesday, where they discussed their upcoming elections during what the White House says is a critical time for democracy globally. Publicly, Biden affirmed support for more African representation on the G20 and the UN Security Council, while not ignoring their shortfalls.
As leaders, our people inspire us. They awaken us the possibilities that are within our grasp, and there's so many possibilities if we work together. They tell us hard truths that we need to hear, and sometimes we have trouble listening. They challenge us to live up to the values enshrined in so many of our founding documents and to be worthy of the responsibility given to us by that sacred trust.
That particular message falls on some old ears. Cameroon's Paul Biya is 89. Republic of Congo's Denis Sassou Nguesso is 79, as is Nigeria's Muhammadu Buhari. Many of these men, and all but one African head of state is male, were born well before their countries gained independence, on a continent where the median age is just 18. What will they take back to their homelands, other than full pockets and warm memories? Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
Well, my colleagues Ignatius, Annor and Abby Sun covered the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. They spoke to leaders in politics and the private sector, and I have the pleasure of having them both here with me in studio. Ignatius, Abby, a warm welcome to Straight Talk Africa. First of all, great reporting. There's dozens of countries represented here. It was a lot of work, and you did some really fantastic reporting. I, for one, appreciate it. Let's start out here, Ignatius. You really covered the breadth and depth of the summit. What was the main takeaway for you from what you saw and reported on?
So thank you very much, Haydé. So the takeaway is a deep commitment from the U.S. administration right now, saying that we do want a partnership with you, and it's what we're calling a 21st partnership with Africa, not just for Africa, but with Africa. We've seen that your people are the voice for the next decade or more, and we want to be able to give you the resources and the partnership that is needed to ensure that there's massive development on the continent, to ensure that the digital innovation that is driving African economies is moving ahead, to ensure that the youth of the continent is being empowered to make sure that democracy is at the forefront of the growth of the continent, really.
And it might seem like it, but I do pay attention to what our viewers and our listeners and our followers say on social media. I saw a lot of posts talking about trust. Oh, African leaders, don't get into this relationship again. Don't be fooled again. I mean, the continent obviously does not exist in a vacuum. It is important for Africa to engage, or African nations to engage on the international stage. But this issue of trust between the United States, the fact that every so often there's a new administration, where do you take all that commitment and all that energy that you put into one administration when it changes hands and there might be new policies? What do you think was accomplished in terms of that trust gap that was there?
And Haydé, you would agree with me that that is valid. It's the second time we're seeing the summit happen, when it was first launched in 2014 under President Barack Obama. But the administration is saying that, look, we're so committed to the extent that we have appointed a special representative who is going to ensure that every paper that was signed, that every commitment that was made will translate from paper into reality. And that's Ambassador Johnny Carson. He's a man that President Biden described as a man with deep respect for the African continent. And when they talk about what he's done over the continent, from East Africa to West Africa to Southern Africa, he knows the continent very well and wants to ensure that we're not just going to have a talk or billions of dollars will be signed on paper, but at the end of the day, that whatever is committed translates to reality to impact the lives of people. I spoke to the State Department yesterday asking when is Ambassador Carson taking, the role, and they said that very soon. There's not a date yet, but the first commitment of announcing his nomination is critical. So very soon, he should be ensuring that all the 3 days event that we saw brings real change into the lives of Africans.
Well, it's good to put a person in charge of actually making some of these commitments a reality. Abby, you spoke to many folks in the private sector. What were they telling you, and what was sort of their assessment of what they saw and heard at the summit?
I think I was definitely second Ignatius. It is a successful event because many people from the private sectors came to the United States in Washington, D.C. They have a clear goal. Who are they going to meet? Who are they trying to connect with, right? So whether it's government officials in their own country, in their fellow countries and on the continent, or they're trying to find partnership in the United States. So with that clear goal, many private sectors companies were able to connect to those people, because imagine if they were in their own country, how is it possible to talk to 5 or 7 minister-level government officials in 3 days? It's impossible. So I would say for them, it's a very successful one. And also, some people told me, in the past, those kind of conferences, you talk big. A lot of people talk very broad, abstract concept. But this is actually the first one. People start realizing, they invited private sectors, entities who really had years of experience on the ground. They start talking about, specific solutions to very core challenge on the continent. So I think from the private sector, I would say it's a very positive experience.
And so, Abby, $55 billion, do folks in the private sector think that is enough? Do they think there's opportunity for them and for the broader U.S. Africa business relationship?
I think it's a good start, right? Because one, this is the first time after 8 years from the Obama administration, that the first time the U.S. government starts showing some sincere commitment. So this $55 billion, we have a breakdown, right? So there are 4 different sectors as a focus. One is healthcare, $20 billion going to healthcare. And especially after the pandemic, out of the pandemic, that's #1 core sector people are talking about. Second, climate change, right? Climate justice, especially after COP27. And then many countries on the continent started to make the pledge that we're going to figure out sustainable solution for our energy needs. And there's a women partnership, right? How do we engage more women on the continent to contribute in this economic growth? So I think it's a good start. And a very interesting point is, there's so much we talk about being discussed in a whole week-long conference, but there's so much more to do. One of the roundtable investment I attended from Kenya, the President William Ruto said there are going to be a foreign investment conference happening in Nairobi by the end of the March. So there will go be a partnership who led the delegation from the United States. And he said himself, William Ruto himself said he will start a foreign investment committee and he will chair that committee himself. So I think that's some level of commitment people start showing. And from both sides, there's still much work to do.
Ignatius, Abby was talking about who was invited. With these summits, it's always interesting to see who shows up and who doesn't. And the U.S. did come under criticism for hosting some leaders from, let's say, less democratic societies than some just authoritarian regimes. How did all of that play out in terms of who was invited and who wasn't? And then at the same time, who actually showed up?
And before that, Haydé, and just to add on to the $55 billion, on the second day of the forum, there was the U.S. Africa Business Forum. And at that particular event, we had President Biden announced actually a little over $15 billion more that would also cut across various sectors. You talk about tackling food insecurity. There's a $2.1 billion Africa food aid. There's the energy crisis as well. So that's also adding on to the $55 billion that was made. And back to your question now, indeed, the government invited 49 African heads of state. It says that right now we're only giving invitation to states that are in good standing with the African Union, which is the 54 nation bloc. And so it excluded Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and then Mali because of political instability. It also says that we do not recognize Somaliland as a state, and we do not have diplomatic relations with Eritrea. So those states are out. Now, it doesn't mean that we are not, stretching an arm to the state to say that do better, and then we'll recognize your contribution and be able to partner with you as we try to foster a new relationship with the African continent. So out of the 49 that were invited, 45 were present. South Sudan's president delegated his foreign minister, as was South Africa as well. You know what Cyril Ramaphosa has been dealing with. So he wasn't able to be there. Now, state officials are saying that when these guys come, we also have the hard conversations about what are you doing with governance, with human rights abuses. Yesterday, the State Department told me we have designated Mali, Burundi, and other states for, the kind of abuses that they're doing to their people.
And of course, that is always the challenge when you are dealing with an entire continent. Everybody does not have the same ideas about what works and what they want in their society or how they will lead anyway. But I do appreciate the two of you coming here and giving us a little bit of a wrap. VOA journalist Ignatius, Annor, and Abby Sun, thank you so much. And you can find more of their reporting on voaafrica.com. We're going to take a short break here on Straight Talk Africa. And when we return, we will turn our attention to the global fight against racism, racial extremism, and xenophobia. Desirée Cormier Smith will join me. She's the U.S. representative for racial equity and justice, and she'll tell us about the Permanent Forum of People for African Descent. My one-on-one with her after the break.
From around the world. Let's go.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. In August last year, the United Nations General Assembly established a platform to improve the lives of people of African descent. The Permanent Forum on People of African Descent works to combat racism, racial discrimination, extremist movements, and xenophobia worldwide. And earlier this month, that forum held its first gathering in Geneva, Switzerland. Desirée Cormier Smith is the U.S. Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. She was at the forum and joins me here in studio to tell us more. Desirée, a very warm welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Great to have you here. And this is not the first time you and I are talking.
No, it's not.
You've been featured on the show before. Desirée, please tell us again, just as a refresher for people, about your role and responsibilities as the U.S. Special Representative on Racial Equity and Justice.
Well, thanks again for having me. You were my first media interview in this role.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So you will always have a special place in my heart, and it's great to be back today talking about such an important and historic moment. So when I spoke to you, I think I was on the job for maybe 1 or 2 weeks.
Correct.
I have now been on the job for a whole 6 months. So do have a little bit more to report, which I'm really excited about. As you mentioned, this is a new and historic role for the State Department. It's the first time that we have had a senior level representative focused on combating structural racism, xenophobia, and discrimination based on race and ethnicity globally. And my mandate is twofold. It is first to ensure that U.S. foreign policy, processes, assistance, and programs serves to promote and protect the human rights of members of marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous communities. That includes people of African descent. It is also to ensure that U.S. foreign policy, processes, programs, assistance is serving to combat structural racism, xenophobia, and discrimination worldwide. And that is not because we have solved these problems here at home. Let me be very clear about that. We are very much still grappling with these challenges in the United States. But my role was established because we recognize that these are global challenges and they will require coordinated and sustained global solutions to actually solve.
Well, yes, I mean, all the things that you're meant to tackle and will be working on is also just indicative of how deep these problems are. And we do see, Desiree, hate crimes, xenophobic sentiment, anti-immigrant rhetoric on the rise everywhere from countries in Europe, in the United States, and even the country that I am from, South Africa. What worries you most about the trends that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a global trend, and it is extremely worrying. We're seeing a rise not only in anti-Black racism, we're also seeing a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism in Europe. This is extremely concerning. Just last week, the White House, or the week before, the White House had an entire conversation about the rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States, but also globally, and to reaffirm our commitment to combating the rise in this hate. And I want to underscore the really close connection between anti-Semitism and racism. As my counterpart, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, the U.S. ambassador to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, always says, anti-Semitism and racism are two sides of the same coin. You can't fight one without fighting the other. It just doesn't work. They're deeply interconnected. And so we are committed to working together to not only combat anti-Semitism, but to also combat the other worrying rise that we are seeing in racism and xenophobia globally.
And so now, Desiree, the United Nations established the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Can you give us some insight into what exactly this forum is meant to accomplish?
Yeah, well, it's an exciting time. This is a historic forum, and it was launched in December, as you mentioned, earlier this month in Geneva. And I must say, it was the first time I felt such a palatable joy and excitement in the United Nations. And I'm really glad about that, because there are very real challenges and persistent challenges and inequities that face people of African descent around the world. But there should also be a space to recognize the resilience, the contributions, the diversity, and the beauty of people of African descent from around the world. So I think the forum, the launch, did a really good job of making sure that there was space and time given to both of these priorities. And in fact, it kicked off, and I don't know if this was the first time or if this is normal, but it was the first time I'd seen a UN meeting being kicked off with music and a celebration and a performance by an Afro-Latino band. And I can't even remember which country the band was from, because it just felt very familiar. You can hear the influences from the African continent. You can hear the influences of Latin culture and music. You could also hear the influences of Black American jazz, and it was so beautiful and just a joyous occasion. But you know, there were very real things discussed, but a lot of challenges and persistent inequities that face people of African descent on the continent and across the diaspora around the world. And so I'm really excited about this forum. This forum in and of itself is not going to be a magic bullet to solve all of these problems, but I'm most excited about it because it does create a space where civil society, people of African descent, member states, and other stakeholders can come and convene and discuss the real challenges, but also provide real solutions to these challenges as a consultative body to member states on how to address these challenges in a meaningful and impactful way.
You know, the excitement that you're exuding here is so infectious. I hate to be a downer on this, but you know, Desirée, all of this, and even as I was working on the questions to ask you, it really made me think about where I come from, a country that even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed was home to the worst racism in the world. These are hard things to address. These are hard things to eliminate, and these are hard things to reconcile.
That's right.
There's generational pain
Yes.
that people deal with on a daily basis. There are communities, indigenous and ethnic communities, whose suffering has probably never even been recognized in places, much less addressed. When you go around in this role and the people that you interact with, both abroad and at home, what is your message to them about how do we overcome this? It is so intractable, and if you live with it day to day, how can you possibly see that there can be an end to racism? Because at the same time, you're seeing these trends that it's only getting worse in some places. And it's a very real reality for people everywhere they go. What's your message to them? It must be a hard message to give.
It is a hard message, but you can't do this work without hope. Without hope that there can be a brighter future, that there can be a better future. And so the message I give to them is that I see you and I feel your pain is valid. A lot of these communities, whether they be people of African descent, indigenous peoples, Roma, or other marginalized ethnic communities, a lot of their struggles emanate from the fact that they feel invisible. They feel unseen, they feel erased. And so a major part of their struggle is just fighting for acknowledgement and recognition that they are a part of their country, that they have contributed to their country's history and current society, and that they matter. And so oftentimes, as simple as it may sound, having a visit and meeting with a senior level U.S. government official and meeting them where they are in their communities and really starting that conversation by acknowledging their pain, by acknowledging the inequities, and that those inequities are wrong and should stop, and that I want to hear from them about the challenges that they're facing, because they know better than I do. They know better than anyone what the challenges they face are and what they need to overcome them. So to start by acknowledging that and acknowledging their agency and just listening, that in and of itself, I've heard, has been quite powerful. Now, again, that in and of itself is not going to solve their challenges, but my work has to start by listening to these communities and engaging with them, and then taking into account their feedback and their input into U.S. policy making in a meaningful way, not as a token, not as sort of window dressing, but in a real substantive and meaningful and ongoing way.
And Desirée, listening to you, I mean, I can see why you were picked for this role. We do not have a lot of time, but I just quickly want to get your take on the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. What's your assessment of how it went?
I think by all accounts, it was a huge success. I'm incredibly proud of my colleagues who have been planning this for years. This has been years in the making, and something that many of us across the diaspora have been calling for, and we're really disappointed to see it hasn't happened since 2014, right? I think there was a lot of excitement and momentum from 2014, and then a lot of that has dissipated because of, just political churn within the United States. But I think this summit sent a very strong and clear and powerful message that this administration cares about Africa and that we want to be equal partners with Africa, because Africa will shape the future, not just Africa's future, but the future of the globe. And there's not one global challenge, whether it be COVID-19, food insecurity, democratic backsliding, that can be addressed without the leadership of Africa. I will also note that, again, going back to the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, I think that's another exciting space that really needs Africa's leadership. And 3 of the 10 members of the Permanent Forum are from the continent, including Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations. And so I think it's really important to underscore that that permanent forum is not just for people outside of the continent of African descent, it is also for Africans. And I think if it serves as a unifying force between people of African descent on the continent and around the globe, it can be incredibly powerful to actually combat anti-Black racism.
Wow, fantastic. Desirée Cormier Smith, the U.S. Special Representative on Racial Equity and Justice. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And that is where we will leave it for this week. A big thanks to all my guests and our affiliate stations airing Straight Talk Africa across the